All right, folks, going from putt to puck on episode 81 of the Spicer Speaking podcast. As I preface, as I open this episode with, talked a lot of hockey throughout this season, what with the introduction of our Coachella Valley Firebirds and a lot to celebrate with our fun new Acrisure Arena, our shiny new debut American Hockey League team, now in the second round of the playoffs. It's been an exciting year. Something I haven't touched upon, not quite as shiny, more confusing, more confounding, more vexing, is what's been going on in the National Hockey League this season, namely as it applies to NHL Pride Nights and the NHL sweaters therein. It's been something that, to be honest, has really bothered me, and something I wanted to flesh out a little bit more. Here to help us do so, we're going north of the border this week, friends. She is an assistant professor of education at Concordia University of Edmonton. Welcome, Dr. Teresa Ann Fowler to the Spicer Speaking podcast. Hello, Teresa.
Hi, Jed. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much for your time. Before we get into the Pride Nights and the sweaters, or the lack of sweaters that some players refuse to wear in their NHL warm-ups throughout the course of this year, let's get into some of your research. I know that you've done ample work. You've testified before the House of Commons in Canada on multiple occasions. A lot of writing on the subject matter of hockey culture and hockey masculinity can maybe educate our listeners a little bit, really, on what you've done, what you've focused on for the subject.
Sure. So my research has sort of spanned within the hockey community from what we call here the U18 elite kiddos, right? So the ones still in high school, up to players playing in the NHL, and those wanting to play in the NHL, as well as retired NHL players. I also last year had the privilege of working with a university ice hockey team, men's ice hockey team, and we spent the year together. I would go to their practices, their games, and then once a month we would engage in conversations, just talking about things in hockey culture, talking about things that these university athletes were facing. And that project spun out of my previous project with a research team where we interviewed 21 professional men's ice hockey players. And those players, it really struck us how at the end of every interview, we always have researchers always have a question. Is there anything else you would like to share? So participants have an opportunity. And nearly every single player that we interviewed just thanked us for giving us the time to talk.
Mm.
Because in men's ice hockey, in these elite level leagues, there isn't time for conversations. They cannot talk about, for example, the importance of Pride Night. They cannot talk about the importance of not using homophobic language. It's just a part of the culture. And to speak out against it risks your own way of life, right? And and that's sort of the paradox, is these men in these professional leagues are overpaid. I think we can all agree on that. But at the same time, they have to provide for their families. They have to provide for their way of life. So if they speak out against something, they risk their way of life. And for example, one of the players who was with us in a research study was an active NHL player. And he also was actively pushing against homophobia, pushing against racism. And after that sort of, period of time with his career, he was traded to another team. Then he was traded out of the NHL.
No?
So whether or not it was because of his activism, but it's striking how someone is a good player doing their job, but then speaking out against these institutional movements to try and make hockey more inclusive gets pushed out of hockey.
And of course, that not limited to professional hockey. We see it
No.
across all the major sports with men or women. I mean, you could just as easily reference Colin Kaepernick, love him or hate him, what happened to him with
Yep.
his social views and stances, and essentially blackball and kick out of the NFL despite making it to the Super Bowl and then
Exactly.
never playing again, all for the very same reasons that you just referenced. Anything else from your research from that project in particular as it pertains to the subject of, since we're going to be talking about Pride Nights, I mean, let's just
Hmm.
specify homophobia and
Hmm.
some of the fears perhaps that these players had about speaking out or sharing their views.
Well, I think really the fear comes from that code of silence, the locker room culture, the fact that the game is what matters more than the individual. Like, for example, when I worked with the university team, we walked through, we have in Canada now, we're adopting safe practices of safe sport. So there's a list of, I don't know what you would call them, but maltreatment in sports. So a list of different abuses. And when we worked through them, what was striking to me was the team could not come up with individual violations of human rights, but they could easily come up with team violations of human rights. So there really isn't much room for an individual on the team sport. And so, therefore, if you are, say, an individual who is gay, you're a gay man playing hockey, there's no room for that. And even in our study, we did have one player who was gay, but not while he was playing hockey. And it was for fear of disrupting the norms in the locker room. It was the fear of taking away from the game. But it really brings into question what is normal with respect to our sexuality, right? We assume that everyone's in heterosexual relationships. So therefore, anything otherwise is not normal. And that's just not the case, right? Historically, if you look back at relationships, homo relationships, or forget that part, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Same sex relationships have historically been in our lifetime and before our lifetime for generations, except why now is it inappropriate? And it really brings up that question, especially with these individual players now saying, no, I'm not wearing that jersey. I have my own individual rights. How does that fit within the team? Because doesn't your perhaps teammate who is gay, does he also not have the right to come out, quote, come out as gay? You
right.
know?
Let's delve into the situation with the NFL, the NHL, pardon me, with the Pride Nights this year. By my count, instances, nine different instances across the NHL season, including three teams that had Pride Night jerseys that they donned last year in their warm-ups before games, and then those jerseys are ultimately auctioned off, generally for a charitable or a good cause, if not always the case. Three teams that did so last year, opting not to do so this year. That is part of the nine that I count. And among that nine, several players for a few different reasons that we're referencing, as you said, the individuals opting not to do it. Um, Whether it be because of religious beliefs. I think that there were three instances in the NHL where the players would not down the pride jerseys supporting LGBTQ community. And then there were six instances of Russian players either
Mm-hmm.
speaking out toward their religion or potential fear of Russian retribution in their homeland. We'll get to that a little bit more specifically in just a moment here. Nine instances is a lot. It was a
Mm-hmm.
story that, to me, Teresa, it got its due attention. The Athletic, in particular, did an excellent job staying with this issue throughout the year. Broadly speaking, what were your impressions of these players' decisions not to wear the jerseys or the teams opting to cancel those Pride Night warm-up jerseys?
I think, it's very frustrating. It's makes you very angry because there was a lot of movement towards making hockey more inclusive, like the brand hockey is for everyone, is not true. We know that's not true. You only need to do an eye test about the players who are on the ice. Majority of them are white, right? And but with respect to Pride nights, it's it's frustrating in a sense because, so for example, if you look at what also is happening in the United States with respect to women's reproductive rights, there's been a lot of movement to ensure that women have choice, whereas now they're being clogged back. And we see that also happening in hockey. And it speaks to, I think, a bigger issue that often is not talked about in hockey, and that's whiteness. And that's the power of white men, the power of white institutions. And in whiteness research, that's exactly what happens when it is threatened, when the culture of power is threatened, it finds ways to hold on tighter. And so, therefore, if they feel threatened by us bringing in pride nights, by bringing in the fact that sexuality is on a continuum, it's not just man on woman, it's multiple. It threatens the whole idea and the foundation of what that social institution of the National Hockey League is founded on. And that is scary for those people who are in power. However, if you think about the other side, statistically, you cannot tell me that there isn't an openly gay man playing, or there isn't a gay person playing hockey. There is. And so if you imagine how that person feels being a part of one of these teams that says, no, we're going to cancel our Pride Night because there's just too much controversy over it. So then I then am again internalizing the fact that my sexuality is not normal. I am not welcome here. And I have to put up a front. Like, can you imagine hanging out with these guys who you call your brothers? They're our comrades. You know, you're talking about your weekends, the things you're doing, and this person cannot say a thing. They cannot talk about anything. And it speaks about also what would happen if, not that you see this in the NHL, but like in the NFL where they wear the camo jerseys.
Right.
What if I refuse to wear a camo jersey? You know, can you imagine the uproar that would bring, right? Because that camo jersey is reinforcing that same social institution that prides itself on being in control and in power. And so having these moments pop up is really troubling because there's, you know, potential to be more. So unless the NHL or someone steps in and just says, hey, just stop being homophobic, enough, put on the jersey. It doesn't mean you support someone else's, you know, sexual values. It just means you support a community. It means you support a community. And like you said, the funds raised from those events go to supporting LGBTQ organizations. And that also will have an impact as well on those folks.
NHL has had a slogan, hockey is for everybody. But that doesn't seem to ring particularly true in this instances, and in these instances, rather, Teresa. It just rings false, and I would concur with you that it does come across as fearful and exclusive, not inclusive, and really just homophobic. That's the message that I take away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 100%. It's definitely homophobic.
Friends, you're tuning into episode 81 of the Spicer Speaking Podcast. Dr. Teresa Ann Fowler, Assistant Professor of Education at Concordia University of Edmonton, is my guest. Let's get into some of the specifics a little bit more of the refusal to wear these jerseys. In some instances, Teresa, there really were no reasons given. In some, that there were some very specific reasons given. Let's go to the Stahl brothers for the Florida Panthers. And then we can also reference San Jose Sharks backup goaltender James Reimer, all of whom took religious stances, saying that basically supporting the LGBT community was not in line with their Christian beliefs. And this is the part that we could, I don't want to get too deep down the rabbit hole with religion, but
Mm-hmm.
this really pisses me off, to be candid, in that I mean, I stay away from organized religion. I'm a proud Jewish person myself, but I'm still not a religious person because a lot of the religion that I see is, you know, the message is accepting of your neighbor, loving your brother,
Mm-hmm.
understanding the other person. But when you have these objections of people like this, it's saying, well, I'm only accepting of my neighbor or loving of my brother if they're just like me, if their
Mm-hmm.
decisions are just like my own.
Mm-hmm.
These objections to participate and wear these jerseys for these religious reasons, these ring particularly false for me in these instances. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if you saw, I think it was a few weeks ago, Brian Burke was on Hockey Night in Canada, and Brian Burke was one of the folks who was really instrumental in the Pride Nights and the You Can Play project because of his son Brandon coming out as being openly gay. And Brian Burke basically called, like you said, that's bullshit, right? Like he said, I'm a Catholic. It doesn't change my religious values. It doesn't change his relationship with Jesus or whoever it is he worships as a higher power. It supports a community. And like you said, isn't that in essence what religion is supposed to do? But then, like you said, though, when you said my neighbor, I like you if you're my neighbor. That's what the NHL has done is it's created a very exclusive neighborhood that is only accepted if you play by these rules. And these rules have been established to make the game good, to profit a game, the game winning above everything else. So as long as our neighborhood, as long as we're all getting along, as long as we're all, not gay, as long as we're all heterosexual, let's say as long as we're all white, as long as we're all this, then we're fine. But as soon as you step out of that, that's when the trouble comes in because now you're disrupting the neighborhood, right? You get into the NIMBY syndrome. Oh, not in
Right.
my backyard. And that's why you see perhaps players get traded. And you see players get traded when they don't necessarily fit within the culture of a team. Like we know that happens. However, when a player gets traded due to their sexuality, you can't even make a human rights complaint against that
Hmm.
because you can't even come out as gay because your neighborhood is not accepted. There's no safe place for you. And so I think going along the religious standpoint, it's a cop out. It's just saying, well, because I'm this, I don't agree with that. So then do you adhere to every single rule that your religion abides by, right? Like we know that's not true. We know Catholic priests are one of the worst, right? Look at our
Yeah.
own Indian residential school system here in Canada. The religion is not a safe space for anyone. So if you go back into that to say my beliefs don't let me support this, well, what does it also, you know what I mean? Like what else does it restrict you
Right.
from?
Let's get to the other instances, and these are a little more tricky because they all involve Russian players. A little bit of the background on Russia. Russian players represent about 6% of the National Hockey League rostering, which is not a small number necessarily. Harkening back to 2022, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government, they essentially doubled down on their anti-gay and human rights views with what is referred to kind of colloquially as the gay propaganda bill, incredibly restrictive on gay rights in Russia, where you basically banned media, movies, books, advertisements of the LGBT nature or community. Also prohibits basically speaking out or praising individuals praising the LGBTQ community. There are monetary fines that come with that, but to me, that's all very, very vague about what kind of punishment or retribution individuals or perhaps professional hockey players could expect if they participate by wearing a Pride Night jersey and thereby supporting the LGBTQ community. In doing so, we did see an instance last summer where Kirill Kaprizov of the Minnesota Wild, he had a lot of hurdles. We don't know the entire story necessarily of why he struggled to get back to Minnesota from going back home to Russia in the summer, but he did face several encumbrances. And yes, the Minnesota Wild in the year previous did have the Pride Night jerseys. For these players, and I think that their NHL teammates have tried to be empathetic as possible and understanding that they could be in serious danger. We talked about
Mm-hmm.
players, Teresa, losing their livelihoods, losing their
Mm-hmm.
career. Well, for the Russian players, I don't know. Perhaps they could lose even more. Your thoughts on their decisions not to wear the jerseys because of potentially this retribution from their home country?
Yeah, I think you're right that that is definitely a little bit more tricky, but I also think that if we take step outside of the NHL, right? Those players from Russia playing in the NHL could arguably be top players from Russia, let's say.
Sure.
So what happens when the Olympics come around? Do you mean to tell me then that Russia would bench their top players
Good point.
because, do you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
they wore a pride jersey while they were playing for an American team or a Canadian team. So I think we really need to tease out some of those things. And sure, I don't doubt that the threats are not that are real. But then what about those folks who live in these countries who cannot hold hands with their loved one, who risk death if they kiss their loved one in public? To me, that risk is a lot greater. And I also think about, precedents in sport. If we look at, say, Formula One, for example, when you might know the name of the driver, I don't, but or the team, but there was a Russian driver, and when the Ukraine war started, that team let go of the Russian driver. I don't want to have anything to do with Russians anymore, apparently, was sort of what was said. And there weren't any repercussions to Formula One. It's still going, you know what I mean? So
Right.
so I think there has been precedent set with respect to Russia's involvement in sport. And so, but with respect to these players, and folks will push back, well, let sport be sport. It's not a place site of politics. And if that's the case, then why are we having national anthems? Why in the United States, for example, do you have military nights? To me, that's politics. You can't say it's not politics. And what these folks have an opportunity is to use their platform to say, hey, it's changed. It's not hurting anybody. Just let us speak up for these people. We're not trying to influence politics in another country. We're just trying to be a supportive person, trying to be that lighthouse of hope to say that maybe one day in Russia it will be okay to be gay if we stand up for it. And again, I just really question how how big the repercussions would be for these players to wear the jersey.
Going to wind it down with this, Teresa. The NHL valued annually at over four, pardon me, $1 billion. It's big global business to be sure. As we recently saw with, say, like Bud Light and what happened with the transgender representative did not go well for Bud Light. There were some analysts that say, that the incentive for big business to take any stance, to speak out, it's not worth it. It's just going to hurt your business. At the same time, I look, and this is so interesting to me because the NHL and the NBA have the crossover, the concurrent seasons, and the NBA is wonderful. There is no league better in the world when it comes to activism, when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
social issues. But the National Hockey League and Commissioner Gary Bettman and a lot of the team reactions to this issue over the course of the season, grade of a D minus. They totally
Mm-hmm.
flopped. And referencing Colin Kaepernick yet again, teams should have learned. Sports leagues
Mm-hmm.
should have learned at this point that, you know what, take a stance, be
Yeah.
strong, have an opinion, and don't just float around the ether like this because it makes you come off as disorganized. In this particular instance with the NHL, bigoted, I
Mm-hmm.
feel. And you again, a $4 billion business, your leader, the face of your enterprise, and the league and the teams itself, you should have a stance and an answer
Yeah.
ready from these arise. And the National Hockey League did not this year. Moving
Mm-hmm.
forward into next year, what do you foresee, whether it be something sanguine, whether it be a hopeful reaction for when this arises again, or perhaps it's just getting even worse? I don't know. What do you see, Teresa?
Well, I think there's two strands, right? There's hope. I have hope that there will be more positive movement. And with respect to, these sponsorship like Bud Lights and things like that, they also have power. And we saw that in Canada this year when Hockey Canada was put to the fire with respect to the sexual assault allegations, when funders pulled their funding to said, hey, this is not cool. Until you get your ducks in a row, We are not going to give you funding. So they do have power and they do have an ability to take a stand. And I think if more teams do take a stand, they'll realize that we're waiting for you, right? Like that's a very small percentage of folks that are still hanging on to these neoconservative, these old traditional values. That society has changed. Ever since we put a same-sex couple on a Cheerios box, we've been having this conversation. And if teams recognize that there is a real thirst for this change, look at the generations coming behind us. For them, these are not up for debate, right? Transgender kids, you can use a bathroom. If you got to go pee, just go. It doesn't matter, right? So I think when teams recognize that, or leaders in these positions let go, but again, it comes back to power. And it comes back to, are they willing to let go of power? And that's why I think, like we were talking about before, the Coachella Firebirds,
Yep,
correct?
Firebirds, yeah.
Really, that presents a really good opportunity to kind of step into this with a fresh look, to step into this with a very open view of what it means to be in a relationship with someone. There's an Indian scholar, Arundhati Roy. She wrote a very poignant essay about COVID-19. And she asked, what do we bring with us after all of this? So, what can this team do with respect to letting go of all of that baggage? Let go of the homophobia, let go of the racism, put pride tape on your sticks every night, wear a pride jersey every night. There's a real opportunity to make a difference and make a change. And folks will be supportive of that. We have to question, why are people still hanging on to these old forms of power and not letting go? That is sort of the bigger question that we need to address with Gary Bettman and all of those folks.
I appreciate you referencing our CV Firebirds had their Pride Night during Pride Weekend. That was just right after the new year. And those jerseys that they wore and auctioned off, I still see them at Acrisure Arena on a game by game basis. Certainly proud of what we did out here in the desert. And additionally, thankful for your time
Mm-hmm.
today. Really enjoyed chatting with you. Good luck to your Oilers in the
Yeah,
Stanley Cup
yeah.
playoffs. But if you need a new team, you can always come and cheer on the CB Firebirds of the American Hockey League, Teresa.
Oh, you bet. Yeah, we're our end goal up here. I will say, not for all Canadians, but I think we're hoping for a Maple Leaf versus Oiler final. That way we can finally get the cup back here in Canada. But our secret team is Seattle Kraken. So
Ooh.
yeah, so we definitely are looking forward to perhaps coming down and watching some of the Firebirds games.
Okay. Well, know that you're always welcome at Acrisure Arena. We look forward to seeing you down here. Until then, a real pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much for your time, Teresa.
No, thanks, Jed, and thanks for having this conversation.